All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to spend half a minute waiting for everyone to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We'll just get started in about 20 more seconds. Okay, well, hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Kim. I'm the Director of Government and Nonprofit Programs at CommunityConnect Labs, and we are so excited to have everyone join us today for this webinar. We are really excited to show you just a bit about what we're doing on Census, but really our main attraction is our guest speakers from the Census Bureau who will be presenting on their work on the Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators Study, which they've done. That's always a mouthful. I'm going to refer to that as the CBAMS survey and focus groups for the purpose of this conversation. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about just our work, but looking at who's in the room, we see a lot of familiar faces. So you've heard this spiel before. We'll gloss over it pretty quickly, but we do also see a lot of new faces. So we want to make sure that you get a sense of who we are and where we're coming from. And then I'm going to turn it over to our speakers from the Census Bureau, and then lastly leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of this broadcast. You'll see at the bottom right-hand corner of the webinar box, you have a place where you can ask questions. Go ahead and just start entering them in now. We know we have a lot of content that we want to cover. We want to make sure we're addressing as many questions as possible. The last thing I will note is that we are CommunityConnect Labs. We are a nonprofit based in California, and the Census Bureau speakers here today who will be joining us are our guest speakers. We are not in any way endorsed by the Census Bureau, or we're not in contract with them. We just really wanted to make an opportunity for them to share their important work with the folks on the front lines who will be reaching out to these hard to count communities. So just wanted to make that very clear. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is just, overall what we're learning about outreach strategies for hard to count communities. And to back up a little bit about us, we are a nonprofit, as I mentioned, and our mission is to help government and community-based organizations to engage these hard-to-reach communities using mobile messaging. So we do a lot of work outside of Census. We connect people, for instance, to benefits like earned income tax credit or energy assistance. But Census was a really logical fit for us because it involves reaching these populations who are often left out of the national discourse. And so we use text messaging, and we have gotten involved with Census for almost 2 years at this point. Our first involvement was with the local update of census addresses operation, the LUCA operation, which took place last year. We were able to develop a community-based address canvassing tool that we deployed in 9 jurisdictions across the country in 3 languages. We provided technology and training to over 40 community-based organizations and over 1,500 volunteers and staff to canvass over 800 block groups across the country, and we were able to identify over 13,000 newly identified housing units to add potentially to the master address file. So that was really our first foray into Census. We love coordinating with the Bureau. We love participating in their accelerator program earlier this year. We love working with state, county, city, and local governments, as well as with nonprofits. So all of that said, over the last year or so, as we looked ahead to what's next for Census and really reaching out to these hard to count communities, we spoke to a lot of folks and we attended a lot of complete count meetings, and we were able to sort of pull together these 5 key strategies that seem to be forming across all these areas. Now, these strategies they do need to be tailored, but they also just seem to be a common running theme across the geographies that we're working in. So I wanted to share those strategies with you quickly as you're starting to think about what your complete count committees are going to do. And then I'll also share with you very briefly about 5 corresponding mobile messaging tools that we've developed to support and amplify those strategies. But again, that's not really the purpose of this webinar. If you would like to learn more about that, then you could follow up with us afterwards about that. So these 5 strategies for the webinar involve reaching out and establishing local assistance centers. They involve supporting the recruitment efforts for the Census Bureau, given that this is a large recruitment effort that's going to take place. It's making sure that the outreach campaign that's going to take place is coordinated and consistent and available in multiple languages. It's supporting the on-the-ground outreach efforts that are going to also take place. And lastly, it's figuring out how to identify and rapidly respond to misinformation campaigns. So the first strategy I'll briefly talk about is these multilingual in-person and virtual assistance centers. So back in 2010, these centers were actually established across the country, but given that the census has moved for the majority of responses to be done online, and given budget cuts, these centers are just not going to be established in the same way anymore. And so we're really looking to local governments and community-based organizations who are these trusted messengers to establish these centers. But the question is, how do you drive people there? And for people who don't have access to those centers, how do you make sure that their needs are still being addressed? And so the solution that we would recommend is establishing some sort of centralized lookup system for people to be able to ask questions and be directed to their nearest assistance center based on their location and their language. You know, in the Rhode Island test that took place in 2018, the census did test out a kiosk system. So they put up 30 census portals across Providence County, Rhode Island. But each of these portals brought in maybe 3 to 4 responses each. So after the 4-month test, they ended up with 111 responses. And our learning from that is, you know, ultimately everyone, regardless of the region, if you have some sort of outreach effort, it's going to involve putting up these local resource centers. The question to think about is how to drive people to that. And so our help desk tool that we developed is really to help answer those questions, create virtual assistance in multiple languages, and also drive people to these centers. Second, it's a strategy that we're seeing to be very necessary in complete count efforts is amplifying recruitment efforts and workforce development for job candidates. So we know that the census will be hiring close to 500,000 people nationally to work both in the field and in offices. So while there aren't official recruitment target numbers out yet, we, CommunityConnect Labs, we ran our own calculations based on hard count data, the census planning database, historical numbers, and we have some estimates of our own that we believe are going to be the recruitment targets for field and office staff over the next year. You know, this could be 17,000 people that need to be hired in the state of Georgia, 19,000 people in the state of Illinois, 32,000 people in the state of New York. This is a really big hiring list. And so the solution that we suggest to support that, given that the economy is so strong right now, unemployment is low, and we have a really long runway to recruit these people, is to just establish a local job support ecosystem to really encourage and support the right candidates to go through the application process and to make sure that they're reflecting the communities that they count and they speak the local languages. So we developed a tool. We were actually a part of the Census Bureau's Opportunity Project, which is an accelerator program, and we got to work with leaders in the operations team to put together this tool that will help people with their job application process. So we're really excited about that. A third strategy that everyone is looking to roll out in one way or another is some sort of coordinated marketing campaign. So, you know, the census, especially given the timing and how it coincides with a big election year, it's just really important, again, for these trusted messenger organizations to be reaching these hard to count populations and reaching that last mile. So for certain communities, you're looking at needing to reach people in over 200 languages. You're thinking about the different types of organizations, the different types of events that will be taking place, and thinking about the types of access that, again, people in the hardest to count communities need. So are the traditional marketing channels going to be enough, or do you need some other way to reach them in a coordinated and consistent manner? And so our recommendation is to have these trusted messenger organizations you know, provide high-touch interactions, which include follow-ups and reminders, but making sure that they're sourcing them from a centralized library of consistent content templates to just make sure that overall your regional strategy is coordinated and consistent. And so we developed a tool to help with this. We also know that reporting is going to be a really big element about outreach. So, thinking about how many people are reached and giving them a call to action that is, shorter term and actionable. For some places it could be pledge cards, so we could do a virtual pledge card with this tool. But for others, it's, recruiting volunteers, it's sending reminders again, sending them information. The whole theme of this, though, is doing more with less. Hopefully that you are going to have some sort of marketing campaign no matter what, and this will help you scale that. Another strategy that we're seeing taking place in many regions is a boots on the ground outreach strategy. So we are seeing organizations planning big canvassing pushes to cover these hard to count neighborhoods. This requires significant activation and coordination and also reporting to make sure that the canvassing is effective and they're targeting the places that need it the most and you're being the most efficient with your resources. So our recommendation is to, as you evaluate the different tools that are out there for your canvassing, you're making sure that the one that you select is easy for volunteers to learn. Again, given the demographics of these hard to count communities, they're going to be needed to be used in multiple languages. And then for the administrator side, you're thinking about how you're going to cut turf, how you're going to track activity and how you're going to report them. So based on that, we've developed also a canvassing tool to support your activities there. And then lastly, the fifth strategy that we're seeing really bubble up in local complete count activities is around identifying and responding to misinformation campaigns. So, we are in the digital age. This is a digital census. And so, the types of potential misinformation campaigns out there could be quite sophisticated. What is needed out there is more than just social media listening, since certain campaigns have gone through more targeted channels and languages. So, what is a way we could detect those and also to address those rapidly with all the relevant parties and also through the trusted messengers that is more than maybe like an epic takedown on a popular blog. They're, again, thinking about these hard to count communities and what their motivations are, what their attitudes are, how do we really reach them and respond to them. So I will stop there. Those are our 5 strategies that we would recommend you really think about as you move forward with your complete count efforts. Really briefly, our technology solutions that we've developed, like I mentioned, even our local updated census address canvassing tool we developed with input from leadership members in the Census Bureau, and we also participated in a recent accelerator program. But beyond that, again, they are not endorsing these products in any ways, and we are not a vendor to them. Our main goal is amplifying the work that is happening locally. So if you are a state government, a county government, a city government, or a nonprofit organization, that's who we want to support in the work that you're already planning on doing. Like I mentioned, our solutions are available in over 200 languages. And a key differentiator is that this is not an app that we're talking about. We want this to work on, my grandmother's flip phone in a different language. So we want it to be as simple as possible, but also to integrate into other messaging channels, since we know certain populations tend to use certain messaging platforms. So without further ado, what I'd love to do is spend the rest of this hour really focusing on the CBAMS survey and focus groups, the report that was recently released. So we're very pleased to have our guest presenters, Gina Walejko she's the Response and Measurements Branch Chief at the Decennial Statistical Studies Division at the U.S. Census Bureau, and then also Monica Vines, who is a researcher at the Communications Directorate at the U.S. Census Bureau. Again, please enter your questions as you think of them in that box on the lower right, and we'll respond to those at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gina and Monica. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Okay. We are just opening up the presentation. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you very much. What Stephanie just presented is a good example of an organization that took place in, as she said, the Opportunity Project, which is a process for engaging governments, communities, and the technology industry to create digital tools that may address different government needs, including some of our census needs. And during this project, no money exchanges hands, no contracts are signed. So these tech teams like the CommunityConnect Labs really own and manage their own projects. And if the Opportunity Project is something you'd like to learn more about, you can Google it online or go to opportunity.census.gov. Just a little plug for that. My colleague Monica is going to start us off today.
Okay, hi everybody, and thank you, Gina, for that brief introduction of the Opportunity Project. I just want to make one quick note. Sorry, we were a little late calling in. We're having some technological difficulties on our end. So what's actually being displayed is almost the exact presentation I'm going through. I might skip over a couple slides, but as I promised, the organizers will be sending this presentation to you guys for distribution afterwards. So bear with me if there's a couple of hiccups along the way. So anyway, so the 2020 Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators Study Survey and Focus Groups Report Findings presentation is what we're going through today. And going to start with a quick outline. We're going to begin with an overview of CBAMS and move into the study design and methodology. We'll look at key findings, including potential barriers and motivators to census self-response. And finally, we'll discuss 2020 CBAMS conclusions and recommendations. So what exactly is the 2020 CBAMS? The 2020 CBAMS is part of the Research Foundation supporting the 2020 Census Integrated Partnership and Communications Campaign. The purpose of CBAMS is to understand the attitudes toward the census, barriers that may inhibit participation, and motivators that may facilitate self-response. We have and will continue to use the results of CBAMS to inform additional research efforts like developing psychographic mindsets and using those to profile audience segments. However, the primary and most exciting purpose is to inform and inspire the creative strategy. Ultimately, the goal of all of our work is to increase self-response to the 2020 census. By conducting a quantitative survey and qualitative focus groups, the research team sought to answer the 4 research questions that you see listed here. We executed the 2020 CBAMS survey from February 20th to April 17th of 2018. We mailed invitations to 50,000 households across all 50 states in the District of Columbia. The questionnaire consisted of 61 questions. Adults 18 or older were eligible to participate by filling out and returning either a paper questionnaire or by completing the internet instrument. Both of these modes were available in English and Spanish. Also, a $1 to $10 prepaid incentive accompanied the first of our 5 mailings. And we did align our mailing strategy with the strategy plan for the 2020 census. Additionally, to help ensure inclusion, we oversampled Asians, Blacks, Hispanics, and other small sample races. Upon completion, approximately 17,500 people responded to the CBAMS survey, which corresponds to a weighted response rate of 39.4%. And I just want to mention that all numbers in this presentation do come from the CBAMS survey data. And when we explicitly compare 2 numbers, it means they're statistically significant. But when we're not making a direct comparison, the numbers may not be statistically different. Now moving on to the focus group study design. Including focus groups in CBAMS is an innovation from the original CBAMS that we conducted in 2008 in support of the 2010 Census Communication Campaign. This time, we supplemented the survey by talking to groups not included in the survey, like Puerto Rico, groups that may not have had a large enough incidence for which to produce valid statistics, like American Indians and Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and groups that are otherwise hard to measure via surveys, like non-English speakers. At about the same time as the survey, from March through April 2018, the research team conducted 42 focus groups of 308 total participants. These were with 11 audiences in 14 total locations. And we conducted 16 non-English focus groups. These were in Chinese, both Mandarin and Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Spanish, both mainland and Puerto Rico. So all focus groups were transcribed, and transcripts were then coded to identify themes that are related to census response barriers and census participation motivators. Throughout this presentation, we provide quotes which are from the focus groups. It is very important to remember that the focus groups are not representative of the entire population and are not necessarily representative of their respective subpopulations. Quotes are presented in this instance to provide richer understanding of potential census participation barriers and motivators. Here is a list that you can just look at very quickly of the 11 audiences in our focus groups. And now moving on to our key findings, we'll first look at intent to respond. So before discussing the slide, I need to make a very important point. As I already mentioned, we conducted a version of CBAMS prior to the 2010 census, but direct statistical comparisons between that and the current CBAMS are not appropriate due to significant differences between the two in terms of mode, questionnaire, and sample. And in fact, this time around, we intentionally designed the current CBAMS survey with a much larger sample and other methodological differences to allow for statistical inferences for smaller subpopulations than was possible back in 2008. Although for the reasons that I just stated, we don't advise comparing the 2008 CBAMS survey to the current CBAMS survey, there may be some differences that we want to account for. So here we look at one very high level difference between the two surveys. So back to who intends to respond. In our survey, we see 67% of all respondents said that they were either extremely likely or very likely to fill out the census form. In 2010, 86% of all respondents said the same, but the actual mail return rate was 76%, which is 10 points lower. Given that research suggests intended behavior does not accurately predict actual behavior, across the board decreases in survey response rates, increases in government distrust, in a vastly different climate, we can hypothesize that the same rate for 2020 will be lower than 67%, but by how much, we're not able to say at this time. Turning now to knowledge about the census, we found that in terms of familiarity, people generally knew about the census, but don't have specific knowledge beyond that. Here you can see 79% of respondents were at least somewhat familiar, but only 33% reported being very or extremely familiar. We observed the same thing in our focus groups, so when probed, most participants did not communicate a detailed understanding of the census. We heard things like this American Indian and Alaska Native participant stated, "I don't know, isn't that like the people that want to know like everything? They send you letters to your house?" And now we're going to turn towards some knowledge gaps. We asked people a series of questions, some true and some false, as to whether these were actual uses of the census. We found that there is a relationship between census knowledge and intent to respond, although this is an indirect effect. So CBAMS research uncovered some specific gaps in the public's understanding of how the 2020 census will be used. 80% of respondents knew that the census was used to determine changes in the size, location, and characteristics of the United States, which is excellent. That's a high list of all the questions, though. So for instance, just over half of respondents, 57%, knew the census is used to determine how many representatives each state will have in Congress. So we're choosing to highlight a couple more statistics from this slide. First, let's look at knowledge about community funding, which will be very important when discussing motivators. It is true that the census is used to determine how much money communities will get from the government. However, less than 45% of respondents knew that. We have the data to break these numbers down by race and ethnicity. Some questions had more variation by race and ethnicity than others. Here we see every group is less than 50%. Across all groups, there is limited understanding as to whether the census is used to determine how much money communities will get from the government. Responses to this question did not vary greatly across demographic groups. White, non-Hispanic respondents were most knowledgeable at 47%, and that figure decreases to 40% for non-Hispanic, Black, or African American respondents. Alternately, this is an example where there is substantial variability across race and ethnicity, which is important for the development of targeted advertising. Knowledge differences will be most important during the educational phase of the advertising campaign. So we asked respondents whether it was true or false that the census counts both citizens and non-citizens, which is true. 55% of respondents overall answered correctly. This time, however, 60% of Hispanic respondents answered correctly, while only 48% of non-Hispanic, Black, or African American respondents answered correctly. And these are the exact type of nuances that will assist us in presenting the best messages to the groups with which they most resonate. Now turning it over to Gina to start with the potential concerns and attitudinal barriers. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So looking at the different CBAMS responses to the survey, we were able to group potential barriers to participation into 5 categories listed here: apathy and efficacy, concerns about data confidentiality and privacy, fear of repercussions, distrust in the government, and then few perceived personal benefits. Does it matter if I'm personally counted? Well, in the survey, we asked how much, if at all, do you think it matters if you personally are counted in the 2020 census? 41% said it mattered a moderate amount or less. 18% said it mattered only a little or not at all. These are people who do not think the census makes a difference. They might care whether or not they're counted, but they don't think anything will come of it. With this question, the survey unveiled the belief that the census doesn't have efficacy. Of course, our goal is for the Communications and Partnership campaign to influence this opinion, as people who believe it really matters if they are personally counted may be more likely to respond. We're referring to this simply as lack of efficacy. On the other hand, apathy as a potential barrier means I just don't care if I'm counted. CBAMS also found that over 1/4 of respondents were extremely or very concerned that the Census Bureau would not keep their answers confidential. Certain demographic groups reported even higher levels of concern, with 41% of non-Hispanic Asian, non-Hispanic respondents, and 40% of respondents with low English proficiency reported being extremely or very concerned. How concerned are people that the Census Bureau shares data with other government agencies? 24% were extremely or very concerned. And this level of concern is substantially higher among certain demographic groups. 37% of respondents with low internet proficiency and 35% of Asian non-Hispanic respondents reported being extremely or very concerned. Said one Middle Eastern or North African focus group participant, every single scrap of information that the government gets goes to every single intelligence agency. That's like how it works. Individual level data, like the city government gets information, and then the FBI, and then the CIA, and then ICE and military. In addition to concerns about, In addition to concerns about apathy, efficacy, and concerns about data confidentiality and privacy, some respondents expressed a fear of repercussions. 22% of CBAMS survey respondents reported being extremely or very concerned that their answers would be used against them. This concern was highest among some subpopulations. For example, 41% of non-Hispanic Asians and 39% of respondents with low English proficiency reported being extremely or very concerned about this. In an attempt to hypothesize what these concerns might be, we turned to the focus groups. One Middle Eastern or North African focus group participant shared. They could say, look, this community has like X amount of race or something. Let's avoid them, or let's define that area. You can see it sometimes where they don't fund certain schools because it's in certain bad areas. Other focus group participants believe the government would use their data against them personally, expressed one Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander focus group participant about why someone might not participate in the census. Someone might choose not to participate because it can come back and haunt them. Like if you get food stamps, and they will be afraid that it's going to affect their food stamps if they report somebody else is living there. Social science data shows distrust in the government increasing over time. In the survey, we found that 59% of all survey respondents said they did not trust the federal government. 55% did not trust their state government, and 47% did not trust their local government. It is the job of the communications campaign to help mitigate non-response due to distrust in the government. An interesting finding comes from the survey question, do you believe answering your 2020 census form could benefit or harm your community? And then another question that asks, do you believe answering your 2020 census form could benefit or harm you personally in any way? Despite all of the negative things we heard in the focus groups, only 1% of respondents felt harm would come to them or their community. Respondents were much more likely to report either a benefit to self and community. Turning now to the motivators, conclusions, and recommendations from this CBAMS study. Survey findings suggest that 2020 census messaging needs to connect the census with community funding. Although 30% of respondents said the fact that the census helps determine funding for public services in my community is the most important reason to fill it out, only 45% knew that the census is used to determine community funding. This gap in motivating knowledge is a focus as we begin developing creative messages. CBAMS research found a general lack of knowledge about the scope, purpose, and constitutional foundation of the census. It also found 5 high-level barriers: apathy and lack of efficacy, privacy and confidentiality concerns, fear of repercussions, distrust of the government, and few perceived personal benefits. However, it found funding for community needs to be an influential motivator across audiences, especially universal services like hospitals, fire departments, and schools. In conclusion, 2020 census messaging should strive to do 3 things. 1, connect census participation to support for local communities to attempt to address apathy and lack of efficacy. 2, inform the public about the census's scope, purpose, and process, while also addressing privacy and confidentiality concerns and fear of repercussions. 3, engage trusted voices to attempt to address trust-based concerns, especially among the most skeptical and disaffected. So that's the end of our presentation. We thank you very much to everybody who's on the line. I wish that we could actually see your faces. We'll kick it back to the organizers to lead off Q&A.
Thank you so much, Monica and Gina, for that really informative report. And, it's clear that so much went into this study. And, like the goal of this, like any other study, is to get that information out to people who could actually benefit and use the recommendations that you found. So we really appreciate that. So we want to use the rest of the time for questions and answers. As most of you know, the study is available online. These slides will be sent out. So really this opportunity we wanted to create was for you to interface directly with Monica and Gina, who know so much about this, and to ask your questions. So you could type your questions into the bottom right of the webinar panel, and then as they come in, we will go ahead and start answering them. And then once we go through that, if we finish early, we'll give everyone back a few minutes of their day. But we do plan on ending at 11 Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern sharp. So I'll take half a minute to process some of the questions that are going to be coming in. All righty, so we already have a number of questions coming in. So Monica and Gina, we're going to put you on the spot and fire them off to you. So one question is, were there any findings that you could share about differences in barriers, attitudes, and motivators for the 18 to 25-year-old demographic specifically?
Well, one thing that is kind of obvious, but that comes to mind, is that awareness amongst the 18 to 24 level demographic is low because they haven't, well, probably because they haven't actually participated in a census before. So when we in the focus groups heard, and then when we asked people in the actual report, we saw that they kind of hadn't heard about the decennial census as much as other people. So I think with that population, we will face some challenges just teaching them what the Census Bureau is. We also consider at the Census Bureau a hard to count group to be young single mobiles, which are this group of people who are younger, 18 to 24, are single, and then have moved recently. And we did a specific focus group with these people because we know we do have lower self-response rates with them. So targeting that specific group, we know, is something that we will have to do in messaging and communications and partnership activities.
Great, thank you. Along those lines, were there any regional differences that could be gleaned from the data?
Yeah, we didn't actually look at regional differences from the data because the purpose of CBAMS were, we really used it to develop psychographic mindsets, which we're going to be presenting out to the public later and will be available in a modeling and segmentation report. So in that way, we looked at what people's responses were across the United States and how they had similar knowledge of barriers toward and attitudes towards the Census Bureau. So we didn't really differentiate by geography. And the survey wasn't really designed to do that either. And we also use that data to develop an audience segmentation, and that's a tract level thing. And as I said, the results of that will be out in a modeling and segmentation report that I think it's coming out sometime this summer. So if you're interested in some like regional groupings of people with similar mindsets and then also similar demographic and response characteristics, I would encourage you to look at that report when it comes out. And that'll be available if you look at the Census Communications Research website. If you just Google Census Communication Research, it pops right up. And you can find the 2 CBAMS survey reports there right now. And as soon as we have the modeling and segmentation report available, you'll be able to go there and look at it too. And I think that can answer your question then.
Excellent, thanks. And there was actually another question about that report being available, so thanks for including that. We have another question around messaging. So was there any messaging, using civic duty or engagement used? And if so, in any cases, was that more beneficial than using funding as a motivator?
Okay, so we weren't actually testing messaging per se in CBAMS. We were really trying to get an idea of what would be more likely to motivate you. So civic duty was on those lists. For some groups, there were differences, and for every group, the highest motivator was money for community funding.
But civic duty was
the second.
It was a high motivator, so we did test it. I would say look at the report to dig in a little bit more off the top of our heads. I think we're not necessarily like I couldn't quote numbers between groups, but civic duty was something that people said was a motivator. But these kind of broad groups of community funding type messages, when you grouped them together, they were the single highest motivator. But that's because we grouped them together, kind of saw that a bunch of messages had to do with your community or community funding, changes to the community, et cetera. Does that make sense? I guess I shouldn't really ask it. It's a Q&A, but I hope that answers your question.
I'll speak for the group. It's a well-informed, smart group, so I'll say that it makes sense. We've got a few questions going back to the types of marketing and outreach that people should use to target these communities. Generally, what types of marketing and outreach received the best feedback from the HTC communities? So digital, TV, radio, texting, mail, etc.
So, yeah, we don't have that for everybody across the country. We asked some of those types of questions in the CBAMS focus groups. Those focus groups were just with the hardest to count people that we knew we wouldn't have enough of in our survey to respond. So some of the more general public, we actually don't have that information from CBAMS. Our advertising agency we're working with, Young and Rubicam, they have that data and they will use that data to actually target different respondents. But I think if some of the groups that you're interested in, we did focus groups with, you might be able to glean a little bit from that report, but again, it wasn't really the focus of the report. I would say you might want to wait. Again, I'm sorry to bring this up again, but the audience segmentation report, the different audience segments were matched to third-party media use data, media consumption data, and each audience segment has like a 4-page profile where you can see which tracks fall into what segment. You can get a flavor of what different demographics, how they over and under index on national averages. You can get a flavor of how these people are likely to respond. And then you can also get a flavor of what maybe differences in media consumption habits these people get. So if you can wait until that report comes out early this summer, you should be able to find it there. But we didn't actually ask that in CBAMS survey to everybody.
Okay, great. Let's see. So some questions about preferences among limited English proficient individuals or households. How important is it for them to receive information in the language for those who speak English less than very well?
I mean, that isn't necessarily something that we asked about, but I'm assuming it's very important for people to be advertised to in language, to have information in language where they could access, for example, our census helpline, the census questionnaire assistance line. That information will be at the bottom of each mailing that we send out. And how many languages will it be in? 12, I believe, languages. Our internet instrument will also be available in 12 languages. And then I'm not, Monica and I aren't on that language team, so I don't know what the exact numbers are, so don't quote us on any of this. But then the questionnaire itself will be available in many languages if people want to go and look at what the questions are in many different languages. So that type of assistance is definitely something that's important and that the Census Bureau has a commitment to. And that's something that your organizations, can definitely help facilitate.
Right. From what we know, the online questionnaire is going to be available in, I should know, the 12 or 13 languages. I don't remember the exact number.
12 languages online and paper,
you.
And then the rest of the languages are available in CQA, the questionnaire assistant.
Yeah, I don't know how many.
20s. It's
so
pretty much covers everybody.
Yeah, we've actually heard that the paper questionnaire will only be available in English and Spanish. Is that a recent development?
I don't know enough about that. I don't want to misspeak what's going on. I know for sure that it will be. I would suggest that you talk to somebody else about that, because I don't necessarily know. Sometimes they have translated it and made it available in different languages online, but I don't know if that's the plan. But it's going to be mailed out in English and Spanish, bilingual.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is a distinction. I pretty much need to clarify for myself as well, because when I just said available in all those languages, you are right. The mailed questionnaires are either in English or English and Spanish, but I thought that questionnaires were available in other languages. But like Gina said, that's something we'd have to verify.
Yeah, we don't.
Apologies.
Right,
we're the
right.
researchers. Like I said, we're not the language people, so you're not speaking to the correct people about this. It's one of the other 5,000 people working here. Sorry.
Right. Completely fair, and thank you for, we're trying not to put you on the spot here, but it is just so valuable to be able to hear from Census. So for any of the other questions that I asked you, if you're not the reigning authority of it, we completely understand. We've gotten quite a few questions in the last few minutes about the planned citizenship question and about mistrust levels, or any fear related to immigration and deportation. Would you be able to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, we could speak. Hold on a second. Monica and I are pulling something up on our computer. So broadly, the addition of the citizenship question happened when the survey was already in the field. So we couldn't add additional questions to the survey to get more information about people's attitudes towards that addition. We also had our focus groups. We'd already done 10 focus groups, I believe, but we added, the night of the announcement, a battery of questions to our discussion guide, and actually were able to ask questions related to the addition of the citizenship question in those focus groups. So what we found was that the citizenship question might be a major barrier. And again, this is just according to the focus groups, which aren't generalizable to the larger population. But what we were hearing in the focus groups was that it might be a major barrier to groups who, one, felt like the question's purpose was to find undocumented immigrants, and then two, to groups that felt like political discourse was already targeting their ethnic group. We have a few quotes that we've written down. A quote from a Spanish focus group was that Latinos will not participate out of fear. There is practically a hunt for us. Latinos are going to be afraid to be counted because of the retaliation that could happen. It's like giving the government information saying, oh, there are more here. So we have very limited attitudinal information because the survey was already in the field when that was announced.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. The census did recently announce a new test that's going to take place the middle of this year. So in the summer, they're going to test the citizenship question across 500,000 of the hardest to count households across the country. And then there will be a report that I think should be disseminated around October of this year, which should help provide a lot of insight in terms of just, projected self-response rates and just the impact of that question to households who receive it versus households that don't. So I think, obviously with the groups that especially we're working with, it's just something that it's at top of mind for the people they're working with. And our perspective as CommunityConnect Labs is just figuring out, this is going to resolve itself in one way or another. How do we make sure that communities still feel like they could receive trusted information from these trusted messengers on the ground? And how can we provide the resources for them to access the census and participate despite the implications of that question? So, there's going to be more soon on that, I can imagine, over the next year.
Yeah, and a little bit more about that test. The 2019 census test is what they're calling it. It's not just a sample of the hardest to count communities. It is oversampling certain geographies, but it is a national sample. And I believe that some of the findings might be briefed out in October, but I don't know if the report's going to be available until the end of the year.
Yeah, the report is much later. I think there's going to be a lot of internal information disseminated, because one of the other goals of that test, not just to look at the potentially differential response rates between the inclusion of the question and non-inclusion, is also trying to garner any information that could inform placement of media or specific messages dependent on where the differences are occurring. Is it affecting primarily non-English speakers, people who respond via the internet versus paper? So we're going to look at all of that, and those are the insights that are coming out on a flow basis and by October. But Gina's right, the full report will be available much later, but I'm sure we'll be.
Yeah, I would stay tuned to Census. They have this thing called PMR, Program Management. Oh, I don't know if there's another one.
Yeah, they just changed it from being called Program Management Reviews to, I guess, just general informational updates, operational updates about the census. But that would be the best place to, continuing to monitor the press releases in the Census Bureau website, the 2020 Census Research and Testing pages, because we are trying to make things public as quickly as we can.
And for people interested in that test, you will see the results of an experiment, and they'll report out by different demographic subgroups, as Monica was saying, what the difference in response rate was from including versus not including that question. So that's the type of things that you will be able to see.
And thanks for that detail. I'm sure that will also have implications on enumerator and field staff recruitment, given that the lower the projected self-response, the more that it'll be on the enumerators to really help get the rest of the responses. So we'll look
Monica
forward
and I are probably the correct people to talk to how exactly the results of that may or may not affect our staffing. But we do know how they're trying to use it from a communications perspective.
Right. And we've had some helpful listeners message in some resources. We have someone who's managing language access in California clarify for us that, again, the census paper form will be available in English and Spanish, and then there will be 59 languages for language assistance guides and glossaries. So you could find that information also in the program, the PMRs, which I actually didn't realize they rebranded that. But yes, there's a wealth of information online actually through those program management reports that speak both about language access and also about the upcoming test in the summer. So thank you for those resources. It's awesome when our listeners are sending in information like that. Let's see, other questions. Quick question about when the survey was conducted.
February through April of 2018.
Great, thanks for that clarification. And then we have another question about the difference, again, specifically between Spanish speakers versus other limited English speakers in their distrust levels.
So we didn't actually do that analysis. I don't know what the actual numbers of Spanish returns or Spanish speakers were to our CBAMS survey, but we usually find a pretty low percentage of Spanish speakers who self-respond to surveys. And we didn't run those crosstabs in the report. Did we? I don't think so, no. Because unfortunately, when we only rely on self-response, which the CBAMS survey was, we usually don't have a high enough number of respondents to make Spanish-speaking respondents make inferences to. Or we didn't think we would with that.
Okay.
But we do have more information in the focus group report. I would push you to that because we did focus groups with Spanish speakers, both in Puerto Rico and in the U.S. mainland. And you might find some interesting nuggets there. And there's lots of really rich information there.
Okay. So that pertains to another question that came in about going back again to the regional disaggregation of data. So people will be able to go in and see for themselves, for instance, if they want to focus specifically on findings from like California, for instance.
So basically, we weren't planning to release any of the data for CBAMS until after the 2020 census, but the public use file is available with very, very limited support on our website. I can send you the information that too if you're not customers, but participants are interested in accessing that. And I did just verify yesterday that there is a state identifier on that file, but because we did not look at anything by state, I can't speak to the interpretability or the number of responses we had by state, but it's certainly something that you would be able to do additional analysis on your own.
Okay, thanks for that. And we just have a few more minutes.
So you guys know, we wish we could have done analysis on region, and we wish we could have done some more, but we just have like limited staff and time. So some of the, we had to produce a report sooner rather than later, and we want to keep digging into it, and we want the public to keep digging into it too. It's just hard with limited staff to do that.
Sure. And we really appreciate the information that's been sent out already to this point. We are coming up at the top of the hour, so I'm going to need to cut off the question asking here. There is one question, though. This one's a little self-serving, so I will ask it to myself. And it's about how communities could get access to these resources to help motivate people and provide them access and activate them to complete their census forms. I'm not sure what creative resources you're referring to, but if you're referring to ours, which I could speak to a lot about, you could feel free to reach out. This is our website, censusoutreach.org. You could also see our main website, which is CommunityConnectLabs.com. And then my contact info is down at the bottom of the screen, Stephanie@CommunityConnectLabs.com. We are going to send out a follow-up email to everyone with the recording of this webinar, along with our set of slides. And lastly, along with the variety of resources from the CBAMS team. There were some requests about information about the language access, so we'd be happy to send the PMR report on that as well. So look out for that, and then feel free to please reach out, and we're very happy to chat about the local strategies that you're planning and see how else it could be a resource. So thank you very much. Again,
can we just say from a Census Bureau perspective,
sure.
There's to anyone who might want to actually be partnering, we encourage you to go to the website www.census.gov/partners. And I think that you can find some helpful information there. Once we actually officially start releasing some of the creative, you guys will probably have more tools, different types of messaging that you could use and appropriate.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of tools actually once that is out. So I was able to preview in a meeting this morning a little bit of the 2020 specific website that's under development. And there is a partnership landing page there that will have toolkits and all kinds of other customizable census information that can be co-branded with your respective agencies or groups. Also, I know from working on the creative that some of the creative materials we will also make available that they can be customized into ads specifically representing your needs. So there will be a plethora of resources available for partners, both large and small, on our website.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing that. We definitely don't recreate the wheel, right, if you don't have to, and especially since the census knows best of what the census is doing and what's going on. It's really excellent that these resources are going to be made available, and then it'll be on everyone else to make sure that they are relevant and relatable and accessible by the people in their respective hard-to-count communities. So thank you again so much, Gina and Monica, for your time and all for your information, and for being a good sport about all these questions that I was throwing at you. We really appreciate it, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this hour.
Thanks.
Thank you.